Well, thank you so much for coming. Before I even start, I just want to acknowledge not only Brother Dennis, but all of you and the elders. But there were so many people here that I knew were praying for me when I was in Israel. And it made a big difference. It made a big difference. And it's one of the things that blessed me and that I believe I was to bring back to you was to give you that feedback that your prayers were powerful, that they mattered, right? I think it's one of the things that we lack. One of the things I think we all struggle with is prayer. You know, why pray when God knows everything, or is it, why am I asking God for something that he wants to give me? Whatever the case may be, whether it's laziness, whether it's being busy or anything else. But I just want you to know that I was carried by those prayers, and I knew I was carried by them. It strengthened me. And it strengthened me at times when I really needed it. I had periods when I was struggling with doubt. But I just wanted to thank you all for being who you are. I thank God for Brother Dennis, for Miss Rebecca, for each of the elders here, for all of you, because when I was there, one of the things that was used was my ability to share this fellowship. And the fact that this fellowship, it wasn't just me that was coming there, it was that this fellowship was with me in spirit, and this fellowship had actually helped me to be there. So anyway, I just wanted to start with that. So this slide right here, a lot of you know what we're looking at here, but this slide is taken from the east looking to the west. That is the east gate of the temple, and this, where I'm standing right now, this would be the Mount of Olives. So this is where Jesus, the Olivet Discourse, this is where he gave that discourse. And you might remember that in Matthew 24 and in Luke, I forget which chapter it is, 19 or something like that, the disciples asked Jesus, what will be the signs of the end of the age and of your return? And this is where he's answering that. They have left the temple, and they are now on the Mount of Olives, and they ask him that, right? And that's where this whole discourse is given. So these graves right here, these are all Jewish graves. All of these people are buried with their feet facing the temple area, right? Those right there, those are Muslim graves. Those are designed to defile that, because the prophecies say that when Jesus returns, he's going to return on the Mount of Olives, and he's going to enter through the eastern gate. So the Muslims have buried their people right here to defile it, and that gate is sealed. They've got it all bricked up and everything. It's all stoned up and everything else to keep the Messiah from coming in, to keep that prophecy from being fulfilled, right? Not the brightest tools in the box, but anyway. So that's what that is. So it's a fascinating place for those of you that haven't been there. I mean, one of the things I'll also tell you before I start is that I don't have any videos. I've got videos. I hope to be able to share those with people that are interested in them, because they're really profound. Many of the videos are far more moving. The still photographs just won't do it justice. And the videos themselves, just watching those videos, are just really powerful in my view. But I was time limited, and you weren't going to get videos because I'm going to be talking. But anyway, and there's a lot of pictures. So there's a lot of people that have loved Israel for a long time. They've wanted to go to Israel. They've dreamed about going to Israel, and you may have come thinking, okay, I'm going to see some really cool pictures, and there are good pictures, but I've got a lot of pictures of Israel that are beautiful that aren't in this presentation, just because I had to keep the focus on what it was all really about to me. So this is the agenda we're going to cover. Basically, one of the things, what I've done really is lay it out the way that people have approached me with it, because when I would tell people that I felt the Lord wanted me to go to Israel, and that I would talk to people. For years and years, I've engaged with Christians who are either apathetic towards Israel or they're anti-Semitic. They'll say they're anti-Zionist in many cases, which is the same thing as anti-Semitism. If they were smart enough, they'd know that, right? Many of them are smart enough. That's just their cover. But anyway, they haven't understood, why do I love Israel so much, right? And why do I consider them the chosen people still, right? And Brother Dennis started out by talking about the view of this church, the premillennial, pre-trib, view of this church. And what he's really talking about, in my mind, is he's really talking about the perspective that comes from what's called the grammatical, historical, literal hermeneutic. It's a big word. It's the science of Bible interpretation, right? It's just what it is, right? And that's not, a lot of these hermeneutics are developed by churches, theologians, so forth and so on. They say, this is how we interpret the Bible. This approach that we use here, which you may not even be aware of, but it's what comes out of his teaching and the philosophy of this church. This approach is not something that's imposed on the Bible. It actually is inherent in the Bible, because what it basically starts out, the supposition is that God knows how to speak, that God knows how to communicate, right? That God knows how to say what he means, and he means what he says. That's basically what it is, right? And if God wants to use a figure of speech, we should be smart enough to figure out that Jesus is not actually a door, right? And things like that, right? We can, you can figure out where the symbols are usually interpreted by the book itself, so forth and so on. But this is actually critical, because how you engage with the Bible is like the prescription that you get from an optometrist to correct your vision. It's going to determine what you see and how well you see it, right? Whether you see it both near and far, whether you only see it far, or you don't see it near, vice versa, whether you see it at all, whether it's blurry, whether you get confused. And it makes a critical difference. And I thank God that we have that in this fellowship, that's where this teaching comes from. So when I answer these questions that I got it from the Israelis all the time, the Israelis that I was meeting with people that I knew, and I was meeting with people that I didn't know. The people that I knew were introducing me to other people, and they would usually say, he loves Israel. And they would say, well, why do you love Israel so much, right? And because Satan has worked to distort Christian love for Israel. There's actually a vein that runs through the talk about Christians in Israel that basically says, well, they only want the Jews to come back so that Jesus will come back, and they don't really care about us. They just know that Jesus is going to come back, and so forth and so on. Anyway, so that's one of the things we'll deal with. And then how did these relationships that Morgan and I have with these Israeli friends, how did they form? And that's so unique. I mean, so much of what was happening here was God had joined me and Morgan 12 years ago with people that we had no idea were going to prove to be as influential and as potentially significant in the flow of God's work in Israel as they've turned out to be. So I'll just talk about that. And then Brother Dennis has already talked about pretty much how the trip came about. One of the things that I'll tell you is that it started, I've yearned to be back in Israel for many years. I always wanted to be back in Israel. And I would communicate with our friends and so forth. But, life was happening, finances were happening. There were a lot of reasons not to go. But when October 7th happened last year, October 7th, I was struck so powerfully with the desire to be in Israel. And I know my brother Mike Davis, who isn't here tonight, which is a shame because he's also factored into this. But Mike Davis was talking with me, and he said he had the same thing, only he wanted to have a gun with him, right? And all I was thinking about was I just want to be there with my friends. I want to share my love for them, my support for them. I want to sit with them in their grief because I knew they were grieving, right? And I was like, it was so powerful, and I just began to pray. And I prayed for a long time to find out whether this was really God's will, and Brother Dennis was pivotal in that whole thing as well. But anyway, that's how that came about. Brother Don Livingston, who is here, I believe, he one time asked me, well, what's this all about? What are you going there for, right? And I kind of felt bad because all I could tell him was, I think I know some of the things that God wants to do, but I'm not sure about other things. I know this is his will. I think I know some things he's going to do, but I'll have to tell you when I get back, right? It was that kind of a thing. So then what fruit has come from the trip? How did it come about? And what you see right there is that that's all predicated on the questions that the Israelis asked. They just teed me up over and over and over. They would just ask a question. We would just start talking. And I never had a formula. I never had a plan. I just figured the Lord was going to guide me, and he would, and it would happen. It would just happen through conversation and the questions they would ask. And then I'll touch on, well, what's the significance of all this? What, that was great. You had a great trip. The Lord used you. That's wonderful. We blessed Israel, but what do we do now, right? So this is actually the Tamar platform. This was the second platform off of Israel, and that ship is actually a ship. So this ship is what's called a construction dive support ship. It's a deep water construction dive support ship. And so it has saturation diving and all kinds of other equipment and so forth. That ship was owned by a company that I was working for. And I was working on an ocean mining project. It was suddenly suspended, and all of a sudden the company said, we've got 3 projects you can choose from. We got one in Brazil, one in Singapore, one in Israel. I said, I'll take Israel. And they said, well, okay, well, you can either be on the platform or you can be on the ship. I said, I'll take the platform, Now, the reason I took the platform was that I knew that the platform was going to be full of Israelis. I also knew the ship wasn't going to be, right? Because that's my world. I worked in that world. And so I knew that there wouldn't be hardly any Israelis on the ship, but the ship was going to be a whole lot nicer than the platform. I knew that, but I knew that God wanted me to go to Israel, and he wanted me to be with Israelis, so therefore I was going to go on the platform. And it was miserable. It was absolutely miserable, right? I mean, so miserable you can't imagine, because this was the only platform off of Israel at that time. Egypt had cut off their natural gas. They had built their infrastructure on the basis of cheap Egyptian natural gas. When they cut it off, this was the only source of gas that Israel had, and they sucked on the reservoir so hard. It was an old platform, but they were sucking on it so hard that one night it just went down 15 feet, okay? Just suddenly went down 15 feet. The reservoir just collapsed 15 feet. You can imagine what it was like for those guys sleeping in their bunks that night, right? Because they didn't know if it was going to keep going. And it all happened just like that, right? So anyway, because that was the only source of natural gas, they had to just keep it pumping, and they couldn't even shut it down to do maintenance. So therefore, it stunk to high heaven. And it, it was just horrible. It would be so bad, actually, that they would have to minimize the number of people on the platform. So I was actually there to supervise the work to tie in the facilities on that platform with this platform right here. On that vessel right there, you can see what's called a jumper. It's actually to make that connection subsea between one pipeline and another pipeline. This platform was delayed by a hurricane. It was a hurricane that hit New Jersey or something like that. And it was on its way. It was a big hurricane on the East Coast. So what happened was I was only supposed to be there for 2 to 3 weeks, right? I ended up being there for like over 5 months, but it was never I never knew I was going to be there that long, right? So I mean, I actually came home at least one time, I know, and then went back. But it was just so bizarre. But this is how I met these Israelis, right? And it was the most amazing experience of my life. at this time when I went, it was the time up to that point, this was the highest incidence of rockets being fired by Hamas from Gaza into Israel. And they were finally hitting Tel Aviv. And it was really shaking up the Israeli people. And I fly into that. That's what I flew into. And people thought I was crazy for going, right? But I knew that God was working in it. And from the time I left the airport in a cab, I'm witnessing to the cab driver. I get to the hotel, I'm witnessing at the hotel. I'm picked up in the morning, I'm witnessing to people on a bus taking me to the port. I get on a boat, it's taking me out to the platform. I'm witnessing to people on the boat. I get on the platform and there's just one after another. This is just amazing. It's just incredible. But it was interesting because this platform was such a strategic platform that it was guarded by Israeli SEALs. So they had a team of 8 to 10 Israeli SEALs on there all the time. It had machine gun nest, it had missile launching, things, it had satellite, it had a command room and satellite, surveillance and underwater surveillance, everything else. And all of these people I'm witnessing to, they're Israelis, but they're production people, right? And the SEALs were off by themselves. They were separate. They wouldn't even associate with the regular Israelis. They were just doing their thing. But anyway, so I'm watching these SEALs and I can see they're special, and I'm just wondering what God's going to do. And eventually I start forming relationships with these SEALs. They invited me to their Shabbat meals, right? We began to play chess together. We were doing all kinds of stuff. I became friends with them. And they would, half of them would get off the platform at a time, and then another half would come on. So there was always these people that would knew what was going on. And when these guys would go to get off, they would hug me. We'd go to the side of the platform. The crane was going to pick them up, put them down on the boat. They would hug me. And I would hug them. I'd say, hey, I love you. I hope to see you back. All this. I don't know when I'm going to be gone. I don't know how long I'm going to be here. Maybe I'll see you. Maybe I won't. The other guys that had been there were coming up. They'd say, hey, good to see you, Mike. And I would hug and all this stuff, right? So this was going on. It went on and on. And because I was taken off the platform for periods of time because it was so hazardous to your health to be there, right? And there wasn't anything else going on, then I would go ashore, and sometimes I was on shore for a week. And so I said, okay, I'm going to go see Israel. So I was checking out, and I found out that there was this really good, guide. So I said, contacted her, and I said, how about, let's get together, you show me Israel. Morgan and I had been there in 2008, but now it was different because we were with a church group then. Now it was just going to be her and I. So that's how I met the woman who I stayed with when I was in Israel. So I met the SEALs, Israeli production people, and the woman that I stayed with, who's an Israeli tour guide, and her husband, her family. We had Shabbat meal there, in 2008, and we got to know each other. We toured the country with Morgan and her niece for a couple of weeks, and then I toured with her a couple of weeks after that, so forth and so on. But anyway, we had those relationships. That's where those relationships come from. We had love for them. One of the SEALs, whom you'll see, I'll be getting to him. He's like a son to us. He's been in our home several times. We love him like a son. He's, and he has, I didn't even know how much he's a hero in Israel. I didn't even know that, until this time. I knew he was a commander in the SEALs, and I knew that they did their stuff, but I didn't know that he was recognized nationally as a hero in Israel for the things that he does and all the ways that this connects. But we always loved him, and we always communicated with him and so forth and so on. So now I'm going back there. It's going to be, I arrived there on the 2nd. Jewish New Year is going to be like on the 2nd through the 3rd. They got October 7th, the holiday of that's coming up. And, then you get Rosh Hashanah, the festival of, Sukkot and so forth. And, so I'm coming in, and my heart is heavy. But from the first time that I got on the land there this time, then I felt this incredible love for the land that was even more than I'd ever had before, and this love for the people and so forth and so on. So I think this might have gotten, I don't know whether this got out of whack or not, but this is actually at the Nova, at the music festival, where the majority of the Israeli civilians were slaughtered. And I have videos of this as well, but you're not going to see them here. But anyway, this is one of the shelters. This is a shelter for rockets. That particular shelter had over 20 people in it, and Hamas slaughtered them. You know, I mean, and this happened in multiple shelters throughout there. But it's actually one that there's a lot of videos on it where a young Israeli soldier who was there at the rave ends up throwing out grenade after grenade after grenade, and finally one got him. But everywhere you go, everywhere you went, you had these things about the missiles. Everybody always knew, okay, hey, if this happens, you know, you got to go. So this is one of the first things I did, and I ended up going to the Nova Festival, and I have videos of this that are so moving, but it is so staggering to walk in that place and to think about what happened there, you know. So you walk around and you see these everywhere, because these are, and you can't really see it here, but you see the stories of the people. You don't really see it here that much, but there are all these stories of these people, and you see them in their youth. Later on, I went into Kibbutz Be'eri. These are some shots from that. This is all from October 7th, and this was very staggering too. Just to go into some of these houses and to see what happened and to know the stories of what happened, and I'll explain a little bit more about that, because I was very privileged to be given a tour by the wife of the general he's actually the head of the IDF officer corps, and he was in command of the southern forces of the IDF, and he lived in this kibbutz. And so his wife actually was the one that was showing me around. He was supposed to be there, but he couldn't get away. So anyway, this one should have been there first, actually. So forgive me. But anyway, so this is actually Ben Gurion when you come out of the customs and everything else, and you're coming now to get out to where you can get a cab. And what you can see not too well here, all along here, you see the walls, everything is lined with the people that are still hostages. You know, it's everywhere in Israel. I put these together because I just want you to understand. A lot of people don't understand the layout of Israel and how difficult it is for them right now. But you know, this one shows there's Gaza right there. This is what's called the West Bank. The West Bank is divided into three different areas: Area A, Area B, Area C. Area A is strictly the Palestinian Authority. They have all the civil control and the military control, you know, the administration and everything else. B is mixed, and C is Israeli control, but it's all considered disputed, right? But you can see this area right here, this one kind of helps you to see a little better. That is the narrowest point of Israel with the Palestinian territories. It's only 8 miles. That's how close these guys are together. And it creates this whole geopolitical issue for Israel. They know that they can be attacked and cut off between north and south, right? So it's really a peculiar situation. I personally think it's going to be changing pretty soon, but we'll see. This is just a standard. You guys have all seen this. This is the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall. And what you see a lot nowadays is you see this, where you have the ultra-Orthodox and you have what's called the national religious soldiers. And so that's a whole other thing. There's the division in Israeli society and so forth, where you have the ultra-Orthodox, which is, you have the ultra-Orthodox and you have the extreme ultra-Orthodox. Then you have the rabbinic Judaism, the Jews, and the Orthodox, basically. And then you have the national religious, which are basically rabbinic Jews, but they aren't so scrupulous about it, And then you have the other forms, the main forms of Judaism, which would be conservative Judaism and Reform Judaism. And you're getting more and more liberal as you go down, right? So Orthodox, pretty conservative, it's all conservative. Ultra-Orthodox are just weird to me, basically. But anyway, the Orthodox are conservative. The conservatives are actually a little less conservative, and the Reform are liberal. And most of the Jews that you see in the United States are Reform Jews, by the way. So that's one reason why you see them, so dedicated to the Democrats and so forth and so on. They're coming from that perspective. And by the way, one of the things that happens in this is that we were talking about that hermeneutic, how you interpret the Bible. In Reform and conservative Judaism, they rejoice over the fact that the rabbis taught them how to read the Bible non-literally. So that's how they can get to where they get to. That's how they can say they're being religious, but advocate for LGBTQ and all kinds of other things. Transgenderism, all this stuff is no problem for them, right? And it's because the rabbis have given them the tool with which to reinterpret the words of the Bible, right? So this is another thing you'll see all the time, everywhere you go. This is actually the entrance to the area where I was staying. This whole street is lined with chairs, baby cribs, pictures of all the people that were taken hostage and so forth. And here, this is actually the gate for kibbutz Kfar Aza. So there were actually a number of kibbutzes that were attacked during October 7th. And Kfar Aza and Be'eri were the worst ones. They were the ones that were hit the worst. But the reason I have this here is because this illustrates a divide that you also see in Israel. It's very profound. And that divide is between the far left and the conservative, right? So, and one of the things that's happened since October 7th is kind of like after 9/11, you saw that there wasn't so much division all of a sudden, right? And there was support for taking action and so forth, right? But you didn't see all the acrimony, and all of a sudden it's like people said, wait a minute, we can't have them be successful in power, because then what are we going to do when there's an election? So they stirred up everything again. You had the same thing happen in Israel. So after October 7th, it's like all the wind came out of the sails. The whole country was like unbelievable, and they're all like, okay, you don't see the protest. I don't know if you knew it or not, if you were looking at the news and so forth and so on. For almost a year, starting in January, there were protests every weekend in all the major cities in Israel, where you had hundreds of thousands of left-wing and highly liberal Jewish people protesting Netanyahu, and they were protesting Netanyahu because he was trying to put through judicial reforms that were very, very important, right? And they're very necessary, but they were trying to get rid of Netanyahu, and they were so powerful that even the elite of the IDF, the most elite of all the elite in the IDF is the Air Force pilots. And even the reserve Air Force pilots were saying, we're not going to go. If we go to war, we're not coming. We're not showing up until you get rid of Netanyahu, right? And they wouldn't show up for their they had to do weekly flight, just fitness checks and things like that. They wouldn't show up for that. And that was one of the reasons why Hamas chose to go ahead and invade. They figured the schisms were so powerful in Israeli society that they would just implode, right? They wouldn't be able to respond. But what you see, like here, when you see all this whole thing with now underlined, that's the left, okay? And what it's designed to do is put pressure on Netanyahu to get rid of Netanyahu. Effectively, there's a lot of ways you can look. Israeli society is extremely complex. It's way more complex than any place I've ever been, in part because of the diaspora, all the Jews that were scattered all over the world, who've now come back into one country. They were in Morocco for hundreds of years, maybe over 1,000 years, and now they're back in Israel. They were in Iraq, or they were in wherever, right? And now they're back in Israel. So you have all this blending of all this stuff and different things and so forth. And it's really complex. But basically, if you want to understand Israel with a broad stroke, then figure that Netanyahu is their Trump. And all the things that you're seeing right now with Trump in our country, that's what you have over there, right? And it's the same people in many cases that are behind it. So this is just another shot. Like I said, it's everywhere you go. Everywhere you go, you're going to see this. And it's a wound in the heart of Israel. And I understand it. It broke my heart. You know, it really broke my heart. And it was so heartbreaking to see it. Okay, here we go. this is this is when I knew I needed to lose weight, right? But anyway, uh, so this is their Jewish New Year, and this was such a trip. And one of the things you see here is you see this is how they do it. The women are back here. The women are not with the men, right? There's, no, I mean, unless you're in a Reform synagogue, maybe you can do that, right? But in an Orthodox synagogue, you don't mingle, right? It's a big issue actually with women wanting to mingle with men at the Western Wall. That's a big issue with a lot of the Orthodox. But it was such a trip. Everybody thought I was really strange, like from some other planet, you know. And but they dressed me up. I got a kippah on, and I got the shawl and all this. And they struggled to find a prayer book that would be in English, you know. And I don't think it was corresponding to what they were saying. They just said, "Hey, kind of read along," you know. Anyway, but it's all in Hebrew, right? You know. And it was so strange. One of the things that's so strange about it is it's very liturgical. It's very, very formulaic, you know. There's not the freedom that we have in our worship, you know, and just the spirit and so forth. You know, it's just very, very structured, and it's the way it's been done for millennia. They're still doing it. They think it's great. Anyway, but anyway, it's really, really strange. And the funny thing is that they will read certain things. So every week, they know what they're going to be reading. It's going to be from the Torah. There might be a parasha that comes from, you know, one of the other books and stuff like that. But they sing it. They don't say it. They sing it. It's sung. You know. It's beautiful. It sounds pretty beautiful, right? It's amazing. All these guys all know it because they've been doing it all their lives. But anyway, it's the same thing, you know. And they're able to sing it. It's melodic. But this was a trip, and it was the first time I've ever been in an Orthodox synagogue. This is Ben Dov Carmeli. This was actually taken when we were there before. This was from 2012. This is the Dead Sea behind him, and that guy right there is that guy now. He's a combat medic in the paratrooper corps. That little boy there is that boy, right? This is Ben Dov going into Gaza, and he and his wife have actually split up, but they're living together again. Like a lot of SEALs, they have a lot of problems with their relationships, right? But it's especially so, I think, in Israel, because they can go from the most intense combat back into Israeli society in a matter of an hour at most, right? It can be less than that. It can be 30 minutes. They're going from an intense firefight where really bad stuff is happening to going into Tel Aviv where people are partying like there's nothing going on, right? And it's just such a shock. It's really hard for them to make that adjustment. So there's a lot of divorce there. This is Ben Dov and his dad. So that's his dad. That's his son that was, you know, is the combat medic. This is his mom. That's Mickey, the woman that I was staying with, and Ben Dov, and we're going to actually meet a representative from a messianic ministry that Morgan and I have supported for many years, One for Israel. It's probably the most effective ministry, in my view anyway. You know, we support Jews for Jesus, Chosen People Ministries, One for Israel, but One for Israel to me is the most effective one, and we're going to meet a representative from One for Israel on that day. So this is another day. There's Ben Dov, Mickey here. This is Dory, her husband. This is a woman, I can't remember her name offhand. She went to Harvard. She's working for a joint venture that Ben Dov is working on. And this guy right here, his name is Gur. I gotta remember all these names, you know. But anyway, his name is Gur. It stands for lion. And when Ben Dov introduced me to him, he said, his name describes who he is. You don't want to get in front of him and have him be your enemy. Yeah, his name is Gur Shriman. So he's a brigadier general. He was the former commanding officer over all Israeli SEALs, and he's the current head of the IDF Officer Training Corps. And I go to this meeting, so I'm in this meeting, and this is where Mike Davis was. So Ben Dove sends me this stuff. He's got this joint venture going on. He just says, hey, here it is. I have lunch with Mike Davis. I say, hey, look, I've got this friend. I'm going to Israel. You know, he's got this thing. They're looking for some venture capital money. Well, Mike Davis does venture capital stuff. It's mainly in high tech. But anyway, so he looks at it. He's interested in it. We establish a meeting. And then that's where we were. We were in an office up in this building. And Mike calls in. And I didn't know that this other guy was going to be there. I didn't know that Gurr was going to be there. I didn't know who he was. I'm meeting him and so forth and so on. It was a wonderful meeting. It was so wonderful because Mike, here's a brother from Midway Baptist Church who is working to bless them. He loves Israel. He wants to bless them. He's talking about his love for Israel, and he's actively showing them his love. And we both go to the same church, and it was such a wonderful thing to be able to communicate that to them. One of the things I haven't mentioned to you yet is that in all these questions that I had from Israelis, one thing that always came up was how, you know, is America going to abandon us? You know, they sense this profound isolation. They sense it growing. They're concerned because they know what's coming. They can sense what's coming, and they sense their vulnerability. And I honestly think that part of that is just their hereditary sensitivity to danger. Because the Jewish people have been persecuted for millennia, right? And they've been to pogroms and so forth and so on. And they can just kind of sense the attitude of the herd, you know, what's going on. There's danger here. And they have been relying on the United States. And if you understand the Bible correctly, what you know is God is going to cause them to not have anybody to rely on but him. And that's what's going on. And they are feeling it. It's rippling through their society, and that worked to my benefit because they were asking me all these questions on the basis of their fears and concerns, right? But anyway, so Mickey and Dory weren't in the meeting. They were waiting. I come down with these guys, and as Gurr and the other lady, she wasn't able to go to dinner with us. We went to dinner. But as we're walking, Dory says, do you know who that is, right? Because Dory he's on the IDF command and headquarters. He does multi-divisional planning, you know, for operations and so forth. And I said, no, I just met the guy. He said, he's telling me who he is, right? And he's like, you know, big guy, you know, very, very famous in Israel. And then that's when I found out how much of a hero Ben Dove is. I didn't know that, right? I just knew I loved the guy. I knew he was a great guy, you know, but he's a bona fide hero in Israel, and I found out that night. So this is Dory and Ben Dove talking at the restaurant there. So I stayed at their house. It's an incredible blessing, but I stayed at their house, and because I stayed at their house, I got to meet the whole family and spend time with them. So this is Dory meeting their oldest son, Asaf. Asaf is a captain in the commando brigades, and this is him going into Lebanon, and they happened to meet before he went into Lebanon. This is Mickey, and that's her husband. He's a Holocaust survivor. He's actually an atheist. He became an atheist after the Holocaust, and we talked to him about the Lord in 2011 and 2012. And he got another dose of it this time, right? You know, but anyway, you know, and it's funny because, you know, I love the guy and he loves me, and you know, you just don't know. I'm just sharing all this with him and sharing my love with him and sharing the word of God with him. And so this is the youngest child. That's Amir. He had just come home. He had a one-day leave from Gaza. He was in Rafah. And he had one day leave to come home. And but I got to spend some time with him. This is us having dinner together. So that's Asaf and the middle son, Uri. And Uri is a decorated hero as well from the Gaza battles. He was due to get married at the end of this month, but the youngest son, his closest friend, was killed in Gaza right when I left. When I left, he was killed, and it threw the whole marriage into, into some, there's just the ripple effect from that. It was devastating to them. Um, so one of the things that happened when I was there, um, as I said, I had kept in contact with these people through WhatsApp. We would have phone calls, there would be text exchanges. Over the years, I would send them things and I would encourage them in the Lord, right? And I would tell them about, they knew I was a Christian and they knew what I believed, and I would just remind them and I would prod them and so forth. One time what had happened was after October 7th, I'm corresponding with Mickey, and she comes back because I'm telling her that she needs to lean on the Lord. I told her, Yeshua, the Messiah. And she comes back and she says, I love God and I love his son. And I'm thinking, whoa, wonder what she means by that, right? And so one of my goals when I went there was to find out just what she meant, right? And it turns out Mickey's become a believer, right? And it's amazing, it really is. But she's like Nicodemus, she's kind of like a secret believer, right? And so when I get there and we're talking and everything, and she tells me, don't let Dory know, right? All this, keep this kind of low and everything. Well, Dory, I start talking to Dory. So Morgan and I had gotten to know Dory when I was there before. We had Shabbat meal there and so forth and so on. But we didn't know him that well. He was kind of like putting up with us, right? Because we were Mickey's friends. But now I'm sitting at his table and we start talking. And this was one of those things where the Lord just, you told me to be supernaturally natural. That's what happened. I can't even describe to you. It happened, and it happened from the beginning, and it lasted the whole time I was there. And it had nothing to do with me trying to make it happen. It just happened. And to me, it was through the prayers of the body and just the Spirit, and it was amazing. It was just amazing. So I'm sitting there, and I'm talking with Dory, and one thing leads to another, and soon we're in the Brit Hadashah. The Brit Hadashah is the New Testament, right? And we're going from the Brit Hadashah into the Tanakh, the Old Testament. And I'm showing him how all this weaves together, and everything, and I can tell, he's really getting into this, and I knew the Lord was knocking on his heart, right? And Mickey was giving us space, and the next day she says, man, he really loves you. He has never done, I can never seen him do anything like this, right? And he just came to bed and he was talking about, how amazing it is and, all this stuff, right? So, we have these talks, we were up till 2 o'clock in the morning, and then I'm sending you guys texts and everything, right? And so, one day, the next day after that, Dory tells me, hey, I've invited this friend of mine to come over. I want him to meet you. And he told me this, it's this guy, right? So this is Eitan Shamir, and he is the director of the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. It's a think tank, and it's associated with Bar-Ilan University, which is outside of Tel Aviv, and it's a major university in Israel. But these guys, I'd read their stuff, right? Because I've always studied geopolitics. I've always found it interesting. I used to think maybe I shouldn't read this so much. I ought to read the Bible more, but I was reading the Bible a lot anyway, and that's how I got it to be this size. But anyway, I knew his stuff, right? And I'm thinking, okay, this is going to be really interesting. I wonder how the gospel is going to get into this, right? And he comes, and we just start talking, and we just start talking. We're talking the world. We're just talking the world. We're talking geopolitics, what's happening, and I bring the New Testament in, right? And I'm talking again. I'm weaving in the New Testament, the Old Testament, talking about Yeshua, talking about the prophecies, all this kind of stuff. And this guy's just tracking with me and everything else. And all of a sudden, and this had to be the Holy Spirit, really. All of a sudden, I just told him, I said, I know you know Colonel Douglas McGregor. Now, you guys might not know who Colonel Douglas McGregor is, but I knew he would know Colonel Douglas McGregor, right? And he goes back in his chair, and his eyes get really big. He says, how did you know I know Colonel Douglas McGregor? I said, well, I just knew that you did. And I said, and I figure you're not friends with him anymore. He says, you're right. I'm not friends with him anymore. And he keeps sending messages through people saying he wants to be friends again and all this stuff. But I had known what was happening, and what was happening is McGregor considers himself a Christian, And he was like a nominee with Trump's administration, and he wasn't passed and all this stuff. He was going to be, I guess, going to Germany. He's a talking head on the news and everything else. He's considered a very astute military analyst, geopolitical analyst, and everything else. And he had gotten into this place where he's looking at what's happening in Israel, and he's forecasting they're going to be wiped out, right? And when I saw that he was doing that, and he's saying Netanyahu is leading Israel off a cliff. So he's kind of joining into the whole thing of we got to get rid of Netanyahu, right? And I knew when he said that, I knew how he was interpreting the Bible, right? And that's when I now start talking to him about the different ways that you can interpret a Bible, and how McGregor, although he's a Christian, is not seeing what I see. And he's now tracking really tight and everything else. And we go through this whole thing, and we're talking about here's what's going to happen, right? Based on this is what the Bible says, right? But he never had considered that. These guys they're not used to going in and talking to other military generals and heads of state and saying, hey, the Bible says this. They're not used to that, right? And you would be amazed, because you would think, I thought before we went to Israel in 2008, I thought that Israel was going to be a much more religious place. But it's not. Actually, the religious people are a small minority. And of that small minority, most of them are rabbinic Jews who don't really know the Bible. The Bible is the Tanakh to them. The Tanakh is the Old Testament. They don't really know the Old Testament. They're kind of like a lot of Catholics. If you're Catholic, forgive me, but I'm just saying, my friends who are Catholic, who've gone to Catholic school all their lives, tell me they know the Bible inside and out because they got it every year for 12 years, and they frankly don't know the Bible that well. They know about the Bible. They don't know the Bible. They've been taught about the Bible, but they don't know the Bible itself. Well, that's the same thing with these rabbinic Jews. They know the Talmud. The Talmud's the commentaries on the Tanakh. And in their world, you cannot understand the Tanakh without the Talmud. The Talmud's going to tell you what the Tanakh says, so why bother reading that? Just read this, And that's how that works, right? So this is the same kind of thing with a lot of Christians. They don't really know the Bible, and a lot of Christians, they don't see the relevance of the Old Testament. One of the things that happened when I was struggling to know whether this was God's will or not is Brother Dennis gives a sermon. His sermon was from 2 Samuel, was it? I think. And the title was the Power of a Visiting Friend, right? Of all things. He didn't know he didn't even know at that time that I was praying about all this, right? And he's talking about how David and Jonathan could have sent a messenger, but he went himself and he shared in the danger of David to strengthen him in the Lord. And when he said that, that was a rhema word for me. It was one of the things that gave me more conviction that it really was God's will for me to go. But most, I don't know if you know it or not, but there's probably the majority of churches in America don't even teach out of the Old Testament. They teach the New Testament. So you wouldn't even know these things. You wouldn't have these applications. You wouldn't, Bill O'Reilly once told in a debate, he said, my God's not the God of the Old Testament, he's the God of the New Testament. And, that was the last time I watched Fox News for a long time. But anyway, so this was a fascinating thing. I had this long discussion with him. Dory finally shut it down. He said, look, I know how long Mike can talk. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. And so, he helped him escape. But anyway, my parting words with him were, the last thing I want to tell you is I want to urge you to use all of your influence to get the establishment of the government of Israel and the military of Israel to do everything they can to be self-sufficient in ammunition and in the weaponry, because they are going to find themselves on their own. And you better use the time you've got to prepare for that, because it's coming. And he knew, it was like a rhema word for him. I could tell, it's hit him, right? We've communicated since then. We have a good relationship. But who would have thought that me, most of you guys don't know this, but I have 1 semester of night school, psychology, anthropology, guitar. I flunked guitar, okay? But, here I am talking to this guy as the director of a think tank, right? I went to sea, I did real well, but anyway, it's another story, But, you just wouldn't think that I would have these relationships, and this is how God works, right? So anyway, this is a book that he wrote. Look at the review up here on the top right. That's Douglas McGregor writing that review, right? This is Martin Dempsey, General United States Army. There's a bunch of other generals on there. You know, this is about the Basis Center, basically what they do. They go everywhere, all over the world, and they consult with governments and so forth and so on. Look who wrote the foreword to his book, H.R. McMaster. Okay, you remember him? You know, he was in Trump's administration for a while. I think he was chief of staff, was he? I think he was, anyway, for a little bit. But they all turned their backs on him, I guess, but anyway. But this is the guy I'm sitting here with, talking to as an equal, helping him understand what the Bible has to say about the things he's looking at, right? And he told me I never thought about that, right? And it was amazing, it really was. So this is actually when I went to Kibbutz Berry. This is the general right here who grew up in that kibbutz. He's the one that's currently the head of the IDF Officer Corps. He was the deputy commander of the Southern Army when it initially responded to the invasion. This is his wife and his daughter. This is their home in the kibbutz. This is actually the home of the librarian of the kibbutz she actually survived October 7th. She was rescued by an IDF soldier, and when he was taking her out, they were ambushed and killed. But there are countless stories around this kibbutz. This guy ends up killing like over 15 terrorists himself, right? But he lost his mother, he lost two of his nephews, he lost his cousins in a wheelchair, disabled for life. His cousin's wife was killed, two of his nephews were killed. You go into the houses and you see the battles and everything else, and it was so sobering. But it was very interesting. This is actually a Messianic fellowship. This one is Tilat Yah, God's praise. It's in Rishon LeZion. That basically means first to Zion. It's I think it's the third largest city in Israel, and they're doing communion here. But what I wanted to show you is that they teach in Hebrew, but there's English and Russian there. I mean, most of the Messianic believers that are in Israel aren't native born. The native borns are called sabras. It's a prickly pear or prickly cactus. It's supposed, the idea is it's really tough on the outside but sweet on the inside. And there's not many of those sabras that are actually becoming Christians yet. But a lot of the immigrants from Russia and Ukraine, they are becoming Christians. And you don't really want to even use the word Christian because it has such a bad connotation from the history of Christian persecution of the Jews. But anyway, I went to this one several times, and it was really wonderful. I didn't understand anything they were saying, but I had a little translator that was helping me out some, and it was very beautiful music. I've got some videos of it I can give you later on. This is another Messianic fellowship that I went to. This is the pastor. He and Brother Dennis are like soulmates because he's got so many issues you wouldn't believe it, And I mean, they could really talk. I'm telling you, And but he's a wonderful guy, and this fellowship's in Tiberias, and to get to Tiberias, normally from where we were living, you would go through that West Bank area, but I knew not to go through there because I just knew that the chances of somebody standing on the side of the road ambushing you is pretty good. So we went via Haifa. So we go to Haifa, go along the coast road, that little 8-mile area. We went through that area and then crossed to the Sea of Galilee to Tiberias, met with this guy. And then when he knew I was going to Haifa, he says, "Are you sure you want to go to Haifa?" Because there were so many rockets going on and everything else. But I had this appointment, and I knew that I knew I was in the Lord's will. And actually, that's another thing I just want to tell you is that one of the blessings of knowing that you're in the Lord's will is the peace that comes with that. You know, I had so much peace that the Israelis, that was one of the questions that they would frequently ask me. Aren't you afraid? You know? And Mickey would say, no, he's not afraid. You know, it's like it's amazing. The guy has no fear. That's right, you know. And I really didn't. And it was a wonderful thing. I just wasn't concerned, right? I mean, I had to deal with all that before I left. But once I made that commitment and I knew that it was the Lord's will, it was over with, right? And one of the verses that guided me there was Acts 20:24, where Paul's on his way to Jerusalem. He says, none of these things move me, neither do I count my life dear to myself, that I might finish my race with joy and fulfill the mission that Christ Jesus gave me, and so forth and so on. And that was what guided me. I just knew that I was on this mission, and I knew I was in the Lord's will, and I just wasn't going to be moved by it. But it wasn't something that I couldn't have made myself be that way, right? It was just in me, and it was by the grace of God. But anyway, this guy, we were having a good talk. I've got a video of him I want to share with you, Brother Dennis, sometime. This would be a good fellowship to try and partner with. This is their building. It looks like garbage, right? It's because the one they were meeting in was burnt down by the Orthodox, okay? The Orthodox basically, so one of the things I heard before I went was that, hey, Mike, you know those people hate your guts, don't you? And, you know, there are people there that hate my guts, right? But guess what? There are people here that hate my guts, right? You know, so big deal, right? You know, I mean, so anyway, but yeah, there's people there that hate our guts. They would hate us, right? But they really hate any Jew that becomes a Christian, right? And what they say to those people is, Hitler killed our bodies, but you're killing our soul, right? So this guy and his believers that are a part of his fellowship have a special place of hatred in the hearts of many of these hardcore Orthodox. And they have tried to kill him. There's one guy that I know of, they sent a letter bomb, it blew up in his son's face and all this, and they burnt down his synagogue, and now they're meeting in this place, and it's like, you know, Fort Knox to get in there and everything, you know, but you wouldn't know. Anyway, it's a wonderful fellowship, and one of the things I was talking to him about was the fact that in the Messianic movement, so with Messianic Jews, right? It's kind of a misnomer in terms because all Orthodox Jews are Messianic too. They just think that the Messiah hasn't come, he's coming, right? But the believers, the Jewish believers in Jesus, they're called Messianic Jews. And there's different groups, there's different denominations, if you will. There's different approaches to how they're going to practice their belief. And it ranges from, on one end, you've got some that want to be so comfortable to any Orthodox guy that comes in that you wouldn't know that they were Christians at all, basically, other than the fact that they used Yeshua's name and so forth, right? Everything else is like by the law, basically. And then you've got variations of that. So I'm sitting with this guy, and I'm trying to feel out, well, where are you on this whole thing? And he said, we read the book of Galatians, right? So anyway, that was all he had to say, right? You know, it was really cool. Anyway, he was a really, really neat guy. Brother Dennis would love him. This is what was happening in Haifa the day that I went there. And the day I went through, that was in the morning. That was the alarms in the morning when I went through. And then I had to cross over to the Sea of Galilee. And then when I came back, there was nothing. When I left, it was like that again. This is just a view. This is the Baha'i temple in Haifa. That's one part of the port of Haifa. The Israeli Navy base is right there on the left. And this is a beautiful promenade. You know, Haifa is a really beautiful area. It's on the foothills of Mount Carmel. That's where Elijah killed all those prophets from Baal and, you know, all that stuff. And it's just a beautiful area. So I'm with another Israeli that I knew, a father of another Israeli SEAL. We got to know him. This is just some other views. That's another view of the port of Haifa. And then this is a Carmelite monastery. It's been there forever. And this is the guy. So this is the Israeli that I was meeting with. And this is a Druze friend of his. And we're at this Druze friend's house. We're up on Mount Carmel, and that's Haifa. That's the Mediterranean on the horizon there. and it's just a really beautiful area, right? So he's taking us. He took us into not Magdal Shames. This was uh, gosh, I forget. It's the largest Druze city in Israel, and the end of it is Carmel, right? And I can't remember the name. And then this guy lives in Isfa, which is right next to it, and he's a really wealthy Druze. And so my friend here, he has heard me give the talk on the New Testament and Yeshua many times as we're going to this Druze guy's house for me to meet the guy. He wants me to meet the guy. He says, now look, he's not religious. Don't bring up religion, right? His wife's religious. She might not even, she'll bring us the coffee and then she'll leave. But he's not religious, so just don't bring it up, right? I said, okay. I really wasn't that interested in talking to the guy when he said that, but I figured, okay, we'll go there and we'll see what's happening. So we get in there, and we're walking around. This guy's showing me his place. He's showing me all the stuff he's got. And he tells me that this is his granddaughter, and she wants to practice her English, right? And, okay, I'm going to talk to her in English, right? So we sit down in this big room, and the wife, with her head covered and everything else, brings out the coffee. This is really strong coffee. I loved it. But anyway, you know, I start talking to this girl. She's doing a PhD program in neuroscience, and her specialty in her PhD is on treatment of PTSD. So that's all I needed. Off we go, right? And I start talking to her about the role that faith can play in dealing with PTSD, and the way I knew it was from Vietnam prisoners of war. There was studies that were done on the prisoners of war when they came back from Vietnam, and the ones that had productive lives and could get on with a life and do well were the people of faith. And the ones that didn't have faith, they were a wreck, right? So I'm talking to her. She's like, oh, my friend is hearing all this because he understands the English really well. The Druze guy doesn't understand the English that well, but he understands it enough, and he's kind of looking, right? My friend's a little nervous, but hey, we're off and running, right? So anyway, I had this great talk with this girl, and I gave her the New Testament too, right? You know, so we'll see what happens there. But it's a big deal in Druze society. If you can't marry outside of Druze society, and you can't convert. It's kind of like they're an offshoot of Islam, and they basically have bits and pieces of Islam, their own Druze thing, and Christianity. But if you convert outside of the Druze faith, then you're out. That's it. It's kind of like in the Jewish world, you're fine if you're an atheist, right? You can be a Buddhist and you can still be a Jew. But if you become a Christian, as far as the rabbinic authorities are concerned, you're out. You're no longer a Jew. It's really bizarre, but anyway, that's the way it is, right? But anyway, it was really fascinating. Had this discussion with them. This is a view from his house again. And he had all this stuff there. I mean, the guy had a hotel. He had all kinds of stuff. You know, he's really doing well. And this is from my chair in the house, and you can see this is his wife with her head covering. The observant Druze women don't sit in the same room. They'll come and serve them, and then they go out, right? So anyway, it was kind of a trip. And this, of course, was a great blessing to me. Again, like I said, you have these Jews kept asking me questions, and these Israelis kept asking me questions. And the number one question, really, honestly, the number one question was, what did I think? Was this the Ezekiel 38 and 39 war that they were engaged in? And what did I think was going to happen? That was the number one question. Then you had, basically, is America going to abandon us? And then they would ask me, do all Christians think like you? You know, I mean, well, you know, because we know there's Christians that hate Israel, and there's Christians that, you know, don't care about Israel and all this. What is it, you know, who are you? You know, why do you love Israel? And, you know, I would talk to them about the evangelicals, Christian evangelicals, and what it means, and the fact that, you know, there's a lot of evangelicals that are walking away from their support for Israel. But man, I got to tell you, when I got this, and I shared this with everybody that I saw, and I was so proud that I could show them this, right? And then there was another one. I think I've got it in here too. This is Morgan later on. You know, when I could show people this, and it was so wonderful for them. They were like, "Oh, that's so wonderful," you know. how many more of you are there, right? You know, and all this. And, you know, I would explain to them why we are the way we are. And I would tell them that this church, I showed them the picture. I don't have it in this presentation, of course, because we see it all the time. But I would show them the picture of our sign. It says, pray for Israel. I would explain to them, that's on a main highway. It's on a very heavily trafficked highway. It's been there since October 8th. And, you know, there's people that don't like it. But it's there. It's because we do pray for Israel and we do love Israel. And it was such a blessing to them. And I was told by more than one person that I was the best ambassador that Israel had, right? And that to tell you guys thank you. You know, they wanted me to convey their thanks and their appreciation for the support that we give them, right? So I think that might be the end of it. You know, so then, so far I've got 5 minutes. I mean, okay, you know, I'm juggling as fast as I can, okay? But anyway, so, you know, at the end of the day, okay, I had this great trip. I mean, I can't express to you what a wonderful thing it was. And one of the really weird things is I didn't have any jet lag when I went there because I was being carried by the Spirit, right? But boy, did I have one coming back, you know, I can tell you. And I'll tell you another thing that's funny, too, is that I didn't see all of the Israelis that I thought I would see. I mean, when I was there that other time, man, we're talking 50 at least that I had long conversations with and shared the gospel with, right? Gave New Testaments to, things like that. I thought I was going to see a lot of these people, but it just didn't turn out that way. But it was more like Philip being sent to talk to that eunuch, right? The people that I talked to, you know, Ben Dove, I had the conversation with Ben Dove. I told him because I knew he was going to, I mean, the guy gets sent into Lebanon. He got sent into Lebanon right after I met with him on this day, but I was able to meet with him. We had a little bit of time. I said, Ben Dove, I don't know if I'm ever going to see you again. You know, the way things are going in the world, I don't know if it'll work out, but I've got something I want to tell you. I think it's really important. And, you know, he and I had talked about the Lord before. One time he told me, you know, he asked me if I really thought that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God. I said, yes, I really do. His response was, I'm beginning to think so too. But that was 2012, right? And so, or maybe it was 2013 or something like that. But anyway, it had been a long time. But one of the things that the Lord had given me was a vision of Ben Dove being instrumental in leading his people to the Lord, right? But I had never shared that with him. I had prayed about it. I prayed for him almost every day, right? And praying for this, right? But now I'm with him. I think I might not see him again. I said, Ben Dove, I got to tell you something. I have had this vision of you. I believe it's true. I believe that we're in the end times. I believe that things are going to take this direction. I believe that in the course of this, you're going to come to accept Jesus as the Messiah, and you're going to lead a bunch of people, a bunch of your people into faith. And I said, I know you might think this is really bizarre. You know, you can do whatever you want to with it. I'm just telling you this is one of the things I believe I was sent here to tell you. And I'm going to try and plug you in with some people that can give you the right discipling after I leave. He says, actually, I don't think it's kind of strange, but I don't think it's bizarre because you're the third person to tell me that, you know, and it is really something, right? I really believe that that's the case, and that's what I'm saying. Dory, one of Dory's best friends, is an Orthodox rabbi. Mickey told me that this Orthodox rabbi has been trying to talk Dory into faith, for years, and she's blown away by the time that we had to spend together. And she told me this Orthodox rabbi said, if Dory ever comes to faith, he's going to be a force of nature, right? Because he is so strong-willed and everything else. And well, here's Dory. He's coming to faith, right? I left the New Testament with Dory. I didn't know how he was going to receive it. Mickey told me he was really grateful, and he's reading it, right? So. And I wrote in there a little note on how he's supposed to read it, and so forth, as far as, but anyway, these are wonderful things. And these were key people. I was able to be a vessel that the Lord would use to speak into their lives, right? So anyway, where do you go from here? I think, one of the things I've learned over time is that everybody doesn't have the same love for the same people, all right, to the same degree. Right? So I think we all, basically have a regard for Israel. It's a biblical regard. I applaud you all for it. But maybe you don't have the same burning desire to reach them that I have, and that's okay, because maybe the Lord's going to put in your heart the desire to reach some other group or what have you. Maybe it's here, maybe it's whatever. But it just so happens that he chose me for some reason. And you know what the Bible says about not many wise and not many all that great. Well, I'm one of those guys, right? But anyway, he used me, it's just it. But it's a wonderful thing, and it's one of the things I want to tell you here. Dennis talks about the fact, Brother Dennis talks about the fact that we're facing some hard times, right? One of the central messages that I gave to these people is you're about to face some hard times, and you better turn to the Lord because you're going to need him, right? That's the only way you're going to get through this. If you think you're going to get through it on your own, you're not. And I was sent here to tell you that. And they were listening, right? They were listening. But he says that again and again in our fellowship. How many of us are listening? I hope everyone is, right? But that's one of the things I came back to tell you is that your support, your prayers, they were a blessing. You guys participated in this. All I was just an instrument that God used through your help and your prayers and the blessings of Brother Dennis and the fellowship here, the leadership here. I was able to do these things, right? So, we're commanded to pray. This whole thing, I'll bless those who bless you. I'll curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. We know what that means. But the bottom line is, what I run into all the time, I run into Christians who say, I don't think the Jews are any different from anybody else. I love everybody. Why should I treat them any differently? I'll just end with this. I'm 1 minute over, okay? Grace, Brother Dennis. Anyway, okay. But anyway, so, one of the things that I would, I'm sorry, I lost my place, so I might as well just end it here. But I can't remember what it was I was going to say, but it was good. It was worth it. But anyway, I know that. But anyway, thank you so much. I appreciate it. If you want, then I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have afterwards. So.